Hi, welcome back to Lesson 6, Percy Buttons. My name is Tammy. Let's read the article about Percy Buttons and then answer the question, who is Percy? Well, by looking at this picture, this looks to be Percy. Stood on his head and sang songs. He's standing on his head. The article says, I have just moved to a house in Bridge Street. Yesterday, a beggar knocked at my door. Beggar. A beggar is someone who doesn't work, but they ask for food and money. He asked me for a meal and a glass of beer. In return for this, the beggar stood on his head and sang songs. I gave him a meal. He ate the food and drank the beer. Food. Food are the things that we eat every day to survive. Like fruits and vegetables and meat. Then he put a piece of cheese in his pocket. A pocket is something that is stitched on our clothing, and we can put things or keep things in our pockets. And went away. Then he put a piece of cheese in his pocket and went away. Later, a neighbor told me about him. Everybody knows him. His name is Percy Buttons. He calls at every house in the street once a month. Here, calls means to come by. He comes to everyone's house once a month. And always asks for a meal and a glass of beer. Let's go over the article again. I have just moved to a house in Bridge Street. Yesterday, a beggar, someone who does not work but asks for food and or money, knocked at my door. He asked me for a meal and a glass of beer. In return for this, the beggar stood on his head and sang songs. I gave him a meal. He ate the food and drank the beer. Food, things that we eat to survive. Then he put a piece of cheese in his pocket and went away. Pocket, an extra piece of cloth on our clothes for keeping things inside. Later, a neighbor told me about him. Everybody knows him. His name is Percy Buttons. He calls at every house in the street once a month and always asks for a meal and a glass of beer. He comes to everyone's house in the street once a month. Now, the question, who is Percy Buttons? Percy Buttons is a beggar. He is a beggar. Now let's answer some questions about what we've just read. Number 1. Has the writer just moved to a house in Bridge Street or not? I have just moved to a house in Bridge Street. She has just moved to a house in Bridge Street. Number 2. Who knocked at her door yesterday? A beggar knocked at her door yesterday. Did he sing songs or did he ask for money? He asked me for a meal and a glass of beer. So he did not ask for money, but he did sing songs. Number 4. What did the writer give him in return for this? The writer gave him food and drink. He gave him food and beer. Number 5. What is the beggar's name? The beggar's name is Percy Buttons. Number 6. Does he call at every house once a week or once a month? He calls at every house once a month. A, the, and some. We can say a pen, some pens, a book, or some books. We can also use some nouns without a or some in general statements. For example, it says, yesterday I bought a book. Books are not very expensive. I have just drunk a glass of milk. Milk is very refreshing. We use the word a when we're talking about one thing. We use the word some when we're talking about more than one thing. And the. It says, a man is walking towards me. The man is carrying a parcel. We use the word the when we're talking about something or someone specific. The man. I'm talking about a specific man. The parcel is full of meat. I'm talking about a specific parcel, the parcel. A dog is following the man. One dog is following a specific man. Now, we cannot put a or the in front of names. So we don't put the word a or the in front of names. For example, it says, John lives in England. He has a house in London. His house is in Duke Street. Now we're going to write these words again and put a or some in front of each one. Some meat, a desk, some tobacco, a tin of beans, a comb, a city, a cloth, some oil, a bottle of beer, a day, a word, a student, some sugar, some rain, an orange, a rubber. Now with the word sugar, since we cannot count sugar because sugar is very small, the particles of sugar, we don't say a sugar, we say some sugar. Now we're going to read the paragraph again, the article again, and put a line under the words that says a and the. I have just moved to a house in Bridge Street. A house. Yesterday, a beggar knocked at my door. He asked me for a meal and a glass of beer. In return for this, the beggar stood on his head and sang songs. I gave him a meal. The beggar. He ate the food and drank the beer. Then he put a piece of cheese in his pocket and went away. Later, a neighbor told me about him. Everybody knows him. His name is Percy Buttons. He calls at every house in the street once a month and always asks for a meal and a glass of beer. Letter C. Now we're going to put either a or the in these sentences. I have just moved to a house in Bridge Street. Yesterday, a beggar knocked at my door. He asked me for a meal and a glass of beer. In return for this, the beggar stood on his head and sang some songs. I gave him a meal, he ate the food, and drank the beer. Then he put a piece of cheese in his pocket and went away. Later, a neighbor told me about him. Everybody knows him. His name is Percy Buttons. He calls at every house in the street, he calls at every house in the street once a month and always asks for a meal and a glass of beer. Now we're going to write these sentences using a, the, or some. Number 1, found, coin, and garden. We can say, I found a coin in the garden. Number 2, put sugar my tea. I put some sugar in my tea. Number 3, cut wood fire. Cut some wood for the fire, please. Number 4, bought newspaper. I bought a newspaper. Number 5, made coffee. I made some coffee. Number 6, like curtains in this room. I would like some curtains in this room. Okay, some verbs change in meaning when we put short words after them. For example, I can say, I put your book on the shelf, or I put on my hat and left the house. Who took my umbrella? It was very hot, so I took off my coat. Come and look at my photograph album. I am looking for my pen. Will you look after the children for me, please? Now let's read these sentences. Each one contains the verb knock. But the verb knock has different meanings in the sentences. The first one says, a beggar knocked at my door. I knocked the vase off the table and broke it. A beggar knocked at my door means he knocked at my front door. But I knocked the vase off the table and broke it means the vase was on the table and I accidentally hit it and it fell off the table and broke. He always knocks off at 6 o'clock means he finishes his work at 6 o'clock. The shop assistant knocked 10% off the bill. That means he reduced the price by 10%. A car knocked the boy over. That means the car hit the boy hard and made him fall. In the fight, the thief knocked the policeman out. That means the policeman was unconscious for 3 minutes. Now, let's put the correct form of the verb knock into these blanks. Number 1, he did not know how to fight, but he knocked the boxer out. Number 2, this flower pot is broken. Who knocked it over? Or who knocked it off? We can also say over, but who knocked it off? I knocked off yesterday and went to a football match. Number 4, listen, someone is knocking at the window. Now let's rewrite the following sentences using the correct form of the verb knock. Number 1, the old lady hit the thief over the head with a candlestick and now he is unconscious. The old lady hit the thief over the head and knocked him out. Number 2, at what time do you finish work every day? At what time do you knock off? Number 3, the shopkeeper reduced the price of all his goods by 20%. The shopkeeper knocked off 20% of all, the shopkeeper knocked off the price of 20% of all his goods. Comprehension. Number 1, Percy Buttons stood on his head and sang songs because he wanted to pay for his meals in this way. Number 2, the writer didn't know about Percy Buttons because she was new to the neighborhood. Number 3, the writer has just moved to a new house. She was at home yesterday. Number 4, she gave a meal to him. Number 5, a neighbor told me about him. He said Percy Buttons was a beggar. Number 6, everybody knows him. They all know him. Number 7, blank does he call? The answer is once a month. So the question is, how often does he call? Number 8, a beggar is a person who asks for money but doesn't work. Number 9, you can have a meal at any time. We can have a meal at any time. Number 10, she gave him a piece of cheese. He put the block of cheese in his pocket, or he put the bit of cheese in his pocket. A bit means a small piece of cheese. He put the bit of cheese in his pocket. He calls at every house in the street. He visits everyone. So calls also means to come by or come to or visit. Number 12, all the houses in our street are the same age and size. Now let us arrange these group of words in the correct order. And a glass of beer, he calls for a meal at every house and always asks in the street once a month. He calls at every house in the street once a month and always asks for a meal and a glass of beer.